Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Ambleman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the final session of our spring series, which has been called Timely Insights, Timeless Wisdom, featuring kind of a wonderful Best of JTS lineup. So we're so pleased that you've joined us, and if today is your first time joining us, then special welcome to you. I also want to welcome back, we haven't had him for a while, Professor Ben Sommer. His session today is called What is the Torah Actually? Preparing for Shavuot. So Shavuot is coming up next week. We've been counting the Omer and learning all kinds of Torah together as we count up towards receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai, or the holiday on which we call that. And we're so pleased that Professor Sommer is joining us today to really get us in the mood to receive the Torah. We're also so grateful to two sponsors of today's session. Yael Asbel, JTS trustee, has sponsored at the Navi level. Yael, we are so grateful to you for just all of your generosity and role modeling, and we know that you've inspired others to sponsor as well. So thank you for your multiple sponsorships. And I'm also so pleased to acknowledge the Talkback group of Temple Israel Scranton and beyond, who are sponsoring today at the Chacham level in appreciation for the Torah that is disseminated from JTS. My screen just froze for a second, and the scholars who share their Torah. This is the wonderful group led by my colleague, Rabbi Miriam Spitzer, in our synagogue, and other folks in the area, I suppose, who watch this session on their own and then gather on Wednesdays to talk about it. We would love for their group, the Talkback group of Temple Israel Scranton and beyond, to inspire other groups. So those who are rabbis, those who are members of synagogues, maybe you can be inspired not only by the sponsorship of this group, but by their modeling of a wonderful way to learn together. We're putting sponsorship information into the chat. And my final announcement for today is I'm so excited to tell you about our summer series. We've decided to feature in our summer series JTS alumni. The vast majority of them are scholars working in academia outside of JTS, and a couple of others working in not as academics, but in educational institutions. So the series is called JTS Alumni in the World, Scholarship and Impact. It's going to start 2 weeks from today, June 17th, and go until August 12th. So we will put information on that into the chat as well. And we've really picked wonderful folks, and I hope that you will join us. On that note, I'm going to turn it over to Tani Schwartz-Herman. And actually, before I do, I just want to thank Tani for all of her tremendous work putting together series after series after series of wonderful learning for us on Mondays. Thanks, Tani.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Andelman. And just to go over the format for today's session, Professor Sommer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We will also have a Q&A period at the end as well. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Andelman, and during the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Sommer. Since we receive a lot of questions, kindly express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today. We'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Benjamin Sommer. Dr. Sommer joined the JTS faculty as Professor of Bible in 2008. He has written several books, which have been the recipients of multiple awards and prizes. His most recent book is Revelation and Authority, Sinai in Jewish Scripture and Tradition, and you can read more about that in the full bio with the sources. Dr. Sommer has long been active as a lecturer and scholar in residence, teaching rabbis, Jewish educators, and lay people in a variety of settings in the United States and in Israel. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Sommer.
Thank you, Tani, and thank you, Julia. And thanks to all of you. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar names and faces, to see friends across the country and even teachers of mine. I see Larry Malitsky, a deeply influential teacher. So it's a real honor to have you at this class, Larry. And thank you to Yale and to the wonderful group in Scranton. It's just great to hear that a group will be continuing talking about this Torah later in the week. I think that's a great idea. I'd love to see other shuls and other groups doing the same thing. So our topic for today is, what sort of book is the Torah? What is the Torah? What is the Pentateuch? What are the 5 books of Moses? As we're coming towards Shavuot, as we're coming towards Zman Matan Toratenu, the holiday in which we commemorate the giving of the Torah, I think it's an appropriate time to pause and ask the question, well, this book that we call the Torah, what actually is it? Because it's really a very unusual sort of book. It's very hard to classify. It's hard to figure out what is the genre of the Torah. What kind of book is it? What is the category into which it fits? I'm not sure that it's necessarily unique. We'll see towards the end of today's session that there are other works that belong to the same category, but it's a very unusual category that deserves some thought. It's hard to answer the question, what is the Torah? What is the category? What's the genre? What's the literary form of the Torah? Especially because the Torah itself contains so many different genres within it, and these genres are so extraordinarily varied. If you open up to the first chapter of Genesis and just start paging through the Torah from Genesis through the end of Deuteronomy, you'll confront a real smorgasbord of different sorts of texts. Of course, there's narrative, there's our stories in the Torah, there's poetry, there's law, and then there's a bunch of other texts that are a little bit more unusual, and it's hard to come up with the right term for them. For example, when we get to the second part of the book of Exodus, we have a lot of directions for how to assemble something. Some of my rabbinical students have suggested that the term IKEA assembly manual. A lot of the book of Isaiah is essentially an IKEA assembly manual that tells you how to put together a particular structure, that is to say the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and how to put together the furniture and some of the clothing that are used inside of that structure. And we actually chant that material out loud every year. A big part of the Torah, a fair chunk of it, is basically an assembly manual. We also have in various parts of the Torah maps in prose format. In the ancient world, by and large, people didn't have visual maps of the sort that we have today. And so when the Torah wants to tell us something about a particular space, usually some two-dimensional space like the land of Israel or the camp of the Israelites as they're walking through the wilderness to get to the land of Canaan, they essentially give us a map, but the map is in prose. It's not visual. Somebody explains this was here, then you kind of go north, take a left turn over here. There's a map in prose format. We've got all these unusual genres in the Torah. The two most common genres are storytelling or narrative and law, but even there's very different kinds of stories that show up in the Torah. We have really mythological creation stories at the beginning of Genesis. We've got stories, collections of short stories about a particular individual like Abraham, or Isaac or Jacob. We've got a novella about Joseph. We've got more historically oriented stories as we go further into the Torah. There's a lot of narrative, and there's a lot of different kinds of narrative within the Torah. We have law codes within the Torah. Some of them are ritual in nature. They give us ritual rules. We get a lot of that in Leviticus, for example, and parts of Numbers. Some of them are civil law or criminal law, or a mixture of civil and criminal law. And then occasionally we get texts, especially in the second part of the book of Leviticus and in parts of Deuteronomy, we get texts that are a mixture of ritual, civil, and criminal law. So we get not only legal texts, legal directions, but we get different kinds of legal directions as we're going through the Torah. But what's the genre of the whole? And what does the centrality of a book with this unusual genre tell us about Judaism? That's the question I want to ask today. What kind of book is the Torah? That is to say, what's the genre of the Torah? And what does the fact that a work that belongs to that genre is so central to Judaism tell us about Judaism? That's where we're going over this hour and a half long session. In order to answer that question, I want to ask another question, and we'll actually spend most of our time on this other question. And that is, I'd like to ask the question, well, why in the ancient world did somebody make the decision to call this book HaTorah? Why did somebody make, or some people make the decision to call this work of literature the Torah? Why was the Hebrew word Torah used as the title for this book? So to answer that, because if we can answer that question, if we can see, well, why did they call it the Torah, we'll be better able to answer the question, what is the Torah? Why would you give that title to this book in light of the fact that it's a certain kind of a book? So we're going to spend most of our time today actually just examining the ancient Hebrew word Torah. I want to go into a great deal of detail in asking the question, what does the ancient Hebrew word Torah actually mean in biblical Hebrew and a bit of some other forms of ancient Hebrew? Because if we can understand what is the meaning or what are the meanings of this word, what's the range of meaning, the semantic field that fields that this word covers, then we'll be able to understand perhaps why they decided in ancient times to call the 5 books of Moses HaTorah, why they decided to call it the Torah, and we'll be able to then understand maybe a bit more what sort of book is the Torah and what does the centrality of this book tell us about Jewish culture, about the Jewish religion. So what we're going to spend most of our time today doing is looking at a long handout in which I've selected a lot of different verses from the Bible that use the Hebrew word Torah or HaTorah. We're going to look through these examples of texts that mention that word in order to sort of build a definition of that word. When a linguist, when a scholar of language, when a philologist writes a dictionary, what a philologist or a linguist will do is a linguist will gather together the evidence. Literally what linguists tend to do is they'll have file cards with different examples of the use of a given word. They might have hundreds of file cards. They'll put those file cards in different piles that seem to where they seem to belong together. And once they've done that, they'll be able to give us a definition of this word. It has meanings numbers 1, 2, and 3, and then there's 1A, 1B, 1C, and so forth. In a sense, that's what I'm doing for us today. On the handout, and Tanya, maybe this is a good time to share the handout. On the handout, we can see different meanings of this word as they come up in the Bible. And then on the basis of that, as we come to the end of our session, we'll be able to ask the question, okay, so in that case, what does the range of meanings that we're seeing tell us about the choice of this word as the title of the book, the Torah, the book that in English is known as the Pentateuch. Okay, so we've got the handout up. I'm just trying to adjust my handout a little, my screen a little bit. Okay, excellent. I like to be able to see the people I'm talking to, so I've minimized the handout. So now I can see all of you, and I can be confident that you're not walking out in the middle. That's always nice to know. Okay, so let's just go through. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on this. Go through what are the different meanings of the word Torah. In biblical Hebrew, so right now we're on page 1 of the handout. When I say page 1, I'm talking about you can see a little number 1 on the bottom of the page. This would be, in a sense, page 2 of the PDF if you happen to have downloaded the PDF. But Tani, we're on page 1 of the handout. First of all, let me note something about the etymology of the noun Torah. The noun Torah is derived from the Hebrew verb horah, or lihorot. For those of you who know some Hebrew grammar, horah or lihorot is the Hifil form of the shoresh yud resh hey, and the verb horah first and foremost means to throw something or to shoot something, and especially to shoot an arrow. So on page 1 of the handout at the top, from 1 Samuel and from 2 Kings, I give you 2 examples, and there are plenty of other examples I could have given, in which the verb lihorot means to shoot an arrow. From that meaning of to shoot an arrow, to throw something in a particular direction, this verb develops a secondary meaning that means to show something, to give somebody some directions, or to point. You can think about, in English, we actually use the symbol of an arrow in order to point something out. Similarly, in ancient Hebrew, the verb that meant to shoot an arrow with a bow and arrow, to shoot an arrow with a bow comes to have the meaning to show somebody something, and especially to point in a particular direction. So in the middle of page 1, we've got an example where God shows Moses a piece of wood. The verb there to show Moses this piece of wood is vayorehu, which is a form of the verb horah. So horah means to show something, to point to something. Similarly, in the book of Proverbs, chapter 6, to point with a finger, the verb for to point with a finger in this verse is moreh. Moreh is just a form of this verb to point, to show. In other words, to shoot something, to throw an arrow in a direction, comes to mean to point to something. In particular, this can also mean to point a direction, to point out the way, to give directions in space. So in Genesis chapter 46, on the bottom of page 1, we've got this example that Jacob sends Judah ahead of him to go to Egypt, to where Joseph is, so that Judah can point the way, can show the way before Jacob of how to get to the land of Goshen, the region of Goshen where Joseph was located. So here we've got the verb horah in the meaning of to give directions, to point towards something. From that meaning, by the way, to give directions, to point towards something, the verb horah develops a second meaning, which is very, very common in Hebrew. I didn't even bother giving any examples because many of you know this. It comes to mean to teach. The verb horah means to teach. Therefore, the noun moreh or morah means a teacher. Moreh, people know that word. Moreh so-and-so, morah so-and-so, that's a teacher. A teacher literally is someone who gives us an arrow, gives us a direction, shows us the way towards something. Okay, so with that background, that the word lihorot, the verb lihorot, means to shoot an arrow, to point in a direction, therefore to give directions, and hence also to teach, it follows that the noun Torah, and here we'll go on to the second page of the handout, please, Tani. The noun Torah, its most basic meaning is guidance or teaching. So I just give you a few examples of this from the book of Proverbs. From the book of Proverbs on the top of page 2, chapter 1, we get the following verse: "My son, heed the discipline of your father, and do not forsake the instruction of your mother." The translation here is the new JPS translation of the Tanakh, what NJPS translates as instruction of the mother. In Hebrew, that's Torat Imecha. Torah here means instruction, teaching. It's something that you get from your parents. Similarly, you get that same meaning showing up in Proverbs chapter 3. Torati here is translated as my teaching, and it's in parallel to the word commandments. once we get the idea that, well, teaching gives us guidance about how to live, it provides us with a direction, well, it then makes sense that the word Torah can be used as a synonym for the word commandment. A commandment tells us what to do, how to act. Torah is a teaching that tells us what to do and how to act. And from this, the word Torah develops a more specialized meaning, not only teaching generally, guidance generally, but Torah is a law that has to be obeyed. So meaning number 2 of Torah is that this noun can mean law. So for example, in Jeremiah chapter 9, and there are dozens and dozens of examples I could have chosen, but I happen to have chosen Jeremiah 9. Torah is something that one can forsake. The Lord replied to the prophet Jeremiah, I'm going to punish the Israelites because they forsook the teaching that I had set before them. They didn't obey me. They didn't follow it. They didn't follow the Torah. Well, if the Torah is something you forsake and it's something that is a matter of obedience, the Hebrew there for obedience is shama bikol, an ancient biblical Hebrew idiom that means to obey. If it's something that can be obeyed or disobeyed, that can be followed or forsaken, it follows then that Torah here means basically law. It's a commandment. It's something you're supposed to observe. We get another example of that from a later biblical book, from the book of Daniel at the bottom of page 2. Once we know that Torah can refer to a law, it's interesting to note that it can refer even more specifically to several specific kinds of law. So if we go to page 3 of the handout, we'll see that the noun Torah very often refers to a ritual law. In fact, in the NJPS translation of the Bible, which is the most well-known Jewish translation of the Bible nowadays into English, in the NJPS translation, we see that the word Torah is often translated actually just as ritual. NJPS often just uses the word ritual when talking about, for example, Torat Ha'olah. They translate that in Leviticus 6:2 as the ritual of the burnt offering. Or in the next example from Leviticus 6, Torat HaMincha means the ritual of the grain offering, the ritual of the meal offering. We see a few other examples of this. In another case, they actually use the word rule to translate Torah. Torah can be the rule for how to carry out a particular ritual, and therefore Torah means ritual or rule for a ritual or ritual law. But it's not only ritual law. As we go to page 4 of the handout, we can see that Torah can refer to civil, criminal, or ethical rules as well. So from the book of Amos, chapter 2, I chose an example in which God says to the prophet Amos that God is going to punish the Israelites for certain transgressions. Namely, the transgressions are that they have spurned Torat Adonai. They've spurned the teaching of the law. I'm sorry, the teaching of the Lord. They've spurned God's teaching. So here NJPS is translating Torah with the word teaching. But as you go further into the passage and God gets more specific about which teachings we're talking about, the teachings here tend to be matters of civil law, criminal law, and basic ethical rules. Theft, and especially wealthy people taking things away from poor people. This is the sort of thing that counts as Torah. So an ethical rule or a matter simply of criminal law, that can be referred to as Torah. So NJPS gave us a perfectly valid translation here, that Torat Adonai is rendered as teaching of the Lord, but we could easily have translated this as the law of the Lord, or maybe even ethical rules that come from the Lord. Those would have been valid translations here as well. If we go on to the next page, Torah can also just mean law generally. A nice example of that shows up in Psalm 89 at the top of page 5 of the handout. Again, we're talking about the Israelites forsaking the teaching, forsaking God's teaching. Um, And in this poetic line, we're in the book of Psalms here, which is a book of poetry. Ancient Hebrew poetry often says something and then echoes that statement and echoes it again, so that we often will, as we go from one line to the next line to the next line of a poem, we'll often get synonyms. And this can be very, very helpful for trying to figure out the meaning of a given word. Here we see that Torah is parallel in this poetry to mishpat, to chukim, and to mitzvot. That is, it's parallel to rules and laws and commandments. So here Torah just means a teaching generally. I'll give I think one more example of another meaning, and then I'd like to pause for some questions. The noun Torah can also mean not only a law, but also a legal ruling that you get from a legal authority. You could go to a judge to get a ruling of law, or you could go to a priest to get a ruling of ritual law. So in this sense, the biblical Hebrew term Torah is actually very similar to the later rabbinic term psak or psak halacha. It's a word that refers to a ruling that you get, a piece of guidance that you get from a legal authority in response to a question that you ask. So, for example, in the book of Haggai, on page 5 of the handout, Haggai chapter 2, God tells the prophet Haggai, I want you to go, Haggai, I want you to go and seek a ruling from the priests on a matter of ritual law. And the word that JPS translates here as ruling is actually Torah. It's Sha'alna et HaKohanim Torah lemor. Ask for a Torah from the Kohanim as follows. And then the question that God tells the prophet Haggai to ask a priest is a question having to do with ritual purity of food. So here it's a question of ritual law, in the same way that any of you might call the rabbi of your synagogue and ask for a legal ruling on a question of ritual law. That's what Haggai is being told to do here. So just like I might call Joel Pitkowski, the rabbi of my shul, and say, we opened up the meat drawer and we found one of the, we found a milk knife in the meat drawer. So apparently it got washed with the meat stuff. What should we do? And his training, part of his training as a rabbi, is he's able to answer that question. In modern Hebrew, actually even in rabbinic Hebrew from ancient times, we would say that I'm calling the rabbi for a psak. In biblical Hebrew, instead of the noun psak, we would use the noun Torah. Torah can mean an answer to a question on a matter of ritual law. If we go to page 6 of the handout, on page 6 of the handout, you can see that this isn't only a matter of ritual law. You can also get a Torah when you're asking some other questions. In this famous passage from the book of Isaiah, we're told in verse 3 that many nations, many peoples will go to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple, in other words, the temple of the God of Jacob, so that they can receive instructions, so that he, that is God, may instruct us in his ways. Actually, I don't really like the NJPS using a passive verb here. The Hebrew verb viorenu is active. They'll go to the land of Israel, to the Temple Mount, to Jerusalem, so that God will instruct them in his ways. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, for instruction comes forth from Zion. If you read this whole passage in greater detail, I think what's going on here is the idea is that in the ideal future that the prophet Isaiah is imagining here, there will still be different nations and they'll still have conflicts with each other. But rather than solving these conflicts by going to war, they're going to all recognize the one God and the authority of the creator of the universe over the whole universe. And when they have diplomatic conflicts, they'll send a delegation to Jerusalem, to the temple of that God, where they'll be able to ask a question and receive an answer, and that answer will solve whatever conflict is going on. So if in the future Cambodia and Vietnam have some conflict over the waters of the Mekong River, let's say Cambodia is building a dam, and the Vietnamese don't like this because this is going to prevent them from getting as much water that they need to get from that river. In the old times, before the Messianic era, this might have caused a war. In the Messianic era, however, they'll go to Jerusalem to basically a world court that has only one judge, capital O, capital J. That judge is God, and God will give them a ruling. Yes, the Cambodians can build the dam, but they've got to let X number of gallons go through the dam on a daily basis, no matter what. And any electricity that comes from the dam, they've got to share 20% of it with Vietnam, whatever the ruling happens to be. And the Cambodians and the Vietnamese, maybe they'll be very happy with the ruling, maybe not so happy. But instead of having a war, they'll simply accept that ruling. So that Torah here, it's not just instruction that comes forth from Zion. When you really read this whole passage in context, it's actually a psak, a legal ruling that's coming forth from the temple in Zion that allows these two nations not to go to war. Instead, they simply follow the psak, they follow the legal ruling, and thus they avoid a war. So Torah can mean a legal ruling, not only in the sense of a ritual ruling, which was what we saw on page 5 of the handout from the book of Haggai, but also could be a diplomatic ruling, and presumably it could actually be other sorts of rulings as well that you might get from priests and scribes, which is why on page 7 we see that the word Torah, in the sense of instruction and also legal ruling, is especially associated with priests and with scribes, people who have legal training, people who have studied the texts that tell us what the law should be and how to apply it to a particular case. I think I'll go as far as this just for now. This is a good time to pause. And Julia, let's see if there are questions that have come in that you have been curating.
I have. Great. Thank you. Okay. Well, so the first one will be a little test of how I did in rabbinical school. So someone asked a question and I answered it myself, but then I thought maybe I'll pose it to Professor Sommer and he can answer it potentially better than I did. So someone asked, what's the basis for all these different translations of the word Torah that you're showing us? So my answer was that it's drawn from the context of the verse and the surrounding verses and from other biblical verses, basically that translators look at all the different ways a word is used to determine a set of potential translations and then determine in each case which one of those makes the most sense based on context. So since we're spending so much time on different definitions, I thought it was worth asking you, is that how these different translations and definitions of the word Torah are being derived?
Exactly. So first, just in terms of figuring out what's the range of translations that we can give for the word Torah, what a person who creates a biblical Hebrew dictionary does. So for example, what Professors Brown, Driver, and Briggs did 120 years ago when they created what I still think is one of the greatest works of biblical scholarship of all time, the BDB, the Brown, Driver, Briggs Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew. They literally made it a flashcard with every single verse that has the word Torah. They looked at the context to try to see what meanings make sense in that context. They then probably separated these flashcards into different piles, and that's how they then began to classify them. These piles seem to belong together. They all basically mean guidance. These piles belong together. They mean guidance in a little bit more of a specific way, guidance on how to live, instruction, therefore law. That might have been meaning number 2. Meaning 2b might have been, well, more specifically, ritual law, meaning 2c, more specifically, civil law. That's what they're doing. They're looking at these contexts and then classifying, putting like with like to come up with all these different possible translations. And then let's say the new JPS translators, they own the BDB, they're using the BDB. They're looking also, though, at the context of Isaiah chapter 2, the context of Haggai chapter 3, and they're asking the question, well, of the 7 different meanings that show up in a biblical Hebrew dictionary, which is the meaning that seems to fit best here? And that's very much an art, not a science. And there's more than one answer one could have come up with. I mentioned in some cases that they translated instruction here, but I'm using this really as an example of Torah, meaning more specifically law or ritual law or civil law. There's more than one answer, one right answer that one could give. In a sense, whenever we're reading the Bible in English, when a very, very rich word like Torah shows up that has many different meanings and a lot of different overtones and implications, whatever one term the translator chooses, it's always going to rob us of something. That's always the case whenever you're translating any literary text from any one language to another language, that you're going to lose things in translation. And well, yeah, this is a case. So often I think this is a case that instruction makes sense, but it's a specific kind of instruction. You could have said law here, but if they had said law, maybe that would have lost the idea that this is law that comes not just from a legislator, it comes from a parent figure, because Torah, we saw in the very first examples that we looked at, Torah is first of all associated with parents. It's the instruction that you get from a mother and from a father. So whatever translation we give, we're always losing something. And the translators themselves I'm sure would have been the first to say, of course, instruction isn't the only possible translation we could have given here, or teaching, or law, or ritual. There are other right translations that they could have given in those cases.
Great. Thank you. That was obviously a much more nuanced answer than mine.
Basically the same answer. Basically the same answer.
Okay, and then someone else asked, actually a couple people asked, within just the Bible, we know that the word Torah, continues to, oops, sorry, knock my glass over, continues to have usages over time up until modern Hebrew today, although I think they mostly find their roots here. But the question was, just within the Bible, is there some kind of chronological development of these different usages, or is it just, it means different things in different contexts?
I think there probably is a chronological element. The verb probably originally meant, I'm sorry, the noun Torah probably originally simply meant guidance, direction, teaching, especially something that you would receive from a parent or a parent figure. So insofar as, let's say, a person learning scribal arts would be actually at some sort of school, the teacher is in a parental role. So the teacher is being called the moreh, the one who gives the instruction. And so it begins then to expand. And then probably secondarily, it came to mean instruction in a more specific sense, that is to say, instruction that is law, instruction that is binding, that you have to listen to. But that development had probably already happened in ancient Semitic languages even before the Bible was written. So in early biblical texts, we can find examples of Torah, meaning instruction, teaching, something that comes from a parent or from a teacher. But there are fairly early biblical texts where it already means law, ritual rule for something that involves criminal law. And fairly early in the Bible, we see it meaning legal ruling that comes from a judge or a priest. Those are all, historically, the development probably went from guidance to teaching to various kinds of law to legal ruling, but all of those are already present in some of the older parts of the Tanakh, the older parts of the Bible. A second development is what we're going to get to in just a moment or two. But even there, the one that we're about to get to, that's already the case fairly early in biblical times. So there's a historical development, but that development probably was happening either before biblical times or at the very, very beginning of the biblical period. So the variety of uses is already showing up in fairly early biblical texts. By the way, I mean, there are cases with other words where we can see very, very clearly that this word meant one thing in pre-exilic Hebrew, let's say before the time of the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC, but it develops a different meaning in later Hebrew. That certainly is the case with other words, and that especially pre-exilic and post-exilic Hebrew, we can see a development, a new meaning for a word. With Torah, all of these meanings are showing up already in pre-exilic Hebrew.
It's very helpful and interesting. So there are a couple questions about biblical criticism, and I'm going to hold them because I think that I think the next unit is going to take us a little more maybe in that direction. So let's go back to your material.
Okay, great. So let's go back to the handout. If we could share screen again, please. And we're on page 8 of the handout. On the top of page 8, I give one more example having to do with law. Again, this is a text from the book of Psalms, so it's a poem. And we get at the very beginning of each poetic line, we get the word, we get a particular noun. All of these nouns are parallel to each other, so they have overlapping meanings. They're not complete synonyms, but they're more or less synonymous. And it's just interesting to see all those words that I put in bold. What are the nouns that follow Torat Adonai, the Torah of the Lord? The word edut in this particular context, actually, well, JPS translates as decrees. I actually would translate this more specifically as covenant. In biblical Hebrew, this is different than later forms of Hebrew. In biblical Hebrew, the word edut can specifically mean a contract, a covenant. It's a synonym for the word brit. So Torah can mean covenant. It also means pikudim, which are precepts, mitzvah, which are commandments or instructions, as JPS translates it. I'm going to skip the next one, which is a little bit of an outlier. It's also parallel to mishpatim, which are judgments or laws. So Torah refers to commandments, laws, and it's also covenantal. The very first synonym that shows up here is edut, which again JPS translates as decrees, but a little bit more precisely, this means actually covenant or contract. So Torah here has a very strong legal sense. It's a contract. It's something that puts us in the realm of a covenant. Let's move on now to a different meaning of Torah that shows up in the Bible. But again, this is already showing up in pre-exilic texts, pre-586 BCE texts in the Bible. Torah can come to refer not only to teaching, guidance, laws, ritual rulings, but also it can be the title of a book. It can be the title of a book that provides guidance. So, for example, on page 8, I give several examples where we get a reference to HaTorah or HaTorah Hazot, or in the third case, Sefer HaTorah Hazot, this teaching or this book of teaching, So Torah now is being used as the title of a book. And in these cases from Deuteronomy, and also in a number of cases, as we go to page 9, from historical books of the Bible, like the book of Joshua and the book of Kings, it's often the case that a reference to Sefer Torat Moshe, the book of the Torah of Moses, or Sefer Torat Moshe Asher Tziva Adonai, the book of the Torah of Moses that God commanded us, it refers specifically to what we know as Sefer Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. Pretty much whenever the book of Deuteronomy itself uses the term Torah or Sefer Torah as a reference to a text, a particular text, it's referring to itself. It's referring to the book of Deuteronomy. And when the book of Joshua, Samuel, or Kings refers to a book, a text of Torah, and we're able to identify what specifically it's talking about, it's always referring to the book of Deuteronomy. So in the middle of page 9, I give you an example where 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 6 refers to a specific rule that is written in the book of the Torah of Moses that God commanded. It goes on then to cite that rule from this book of this text of Torah. And it's about parents not being put to death for their children's capital crimes and children not being put to death for their parents' capital crimes. That specific law is found in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24, verse 16, which I give you on the bottom of page 9. I'm giving you an example here of where Second Kings refers very specifically to a written text that gives a specific law, and we can identify that text. That text is the book of Deuteronomy. In this particular case, Deuteronomy 24:16. But that's always the case in the historical books that we get in the Nevi'im, and also in Deuteronomy itself. Sefer HaTorah was used by some biblical scribes as the title for the book of Deuteronomy. Now here we're going, this gets back to the question that Julia gave us just a few minutes ago. As we go from the book of Deuteronomy and the historical books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, into the Ketuvim, into later historical books, we find that there's a shift in meaning. In the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are mostly, I'm summarizing a little bit here, but they are overwhelmingly built from pre-exilic material. In pre-exilic material, we see usually that a reference to Sefer HaTorah, the book of teaching, usually refers to the book of Deuteronomy. When we go to post-exilic, post 517 roughly, post-exilic historical books, the word Sefer HaTorah gets a different meaning. When I say post-exilic historical books, I mean the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, or Divrei Hayamim. I guess in English that would be Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. In Hebrew, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Divrei Hayamim. When we go to those books, they also use the phrase Torat Adonai, the Torah of the Lord, or Torat Moshe Asher Tziva Adonai, the Torah of Moses that God commanded, or Sefer HaTorah, all those sort of terms. When we can identify specifically what they're referring to, it's not only Deuteronomy, it is sometimes material that we find in the book of Exodus or the book of Leviticus, and sometimes it will even be material in a single verse that, let's say, that Chronicles refers to. This is the case, by the way, on the top of page 11. Chronicles refers to rulings that come from Torat Moshe on the top of page 11. And if you read carefully this passage from 2 Chronicles chapter 30, it's referring simultaneously to laws that come from the book of Deuteronomy and other laws that come from Leviticus and Exodus. So Chronicles and Ezra, Nehemiah, when they say Torat Adonai or Sefer HaTorah, they're talking about a book that combines Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In other words, they seem to be talking about what we mean when we say the Torah or the Pentateuch or the 5 books of Moses. So once we get to Second Temple period Judaism, to post-exilic biblical texts, Torat Moshe now actually has the same meaning that we use it to mean. It's referring to not just a text, but to a specific text that we call the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. So in other words, I talked at the beginning of this presentation about how somebody in ancient times decided to refer to the Pentateuch, the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, as HaTorah, Sefer HaTorah. That's already the case in biblical times. We already see that happening in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, in the book of Divrei Hayamim or Chronicles. These are late biblical books, but part of the Tanakh, part of the Jewish Bible. So why did they give that title to the Jewish Bible? Why? I'm sorry, to the 5 books of Moses. Why do biblical authors already in the Second Temple period give this title to the 5 books of Moses? To answer that question, I think it's useful to notice that Torah is a book that provides laws. On pages 9, 10, at the top of 11, we see examples where the book of Torah refers specifically to laws, ritual law or civil law or criminal law, but the book of law, but the book of Torah also provides guidance more generally, not only legal guidance. And so here we're on page 11 of the handout. It's a book that you, first of all, you don't just consult it, but you study it, you murmur it over and over again so that you can memorize it and meditate on it. So it's not just a law book, it's a study book. It's an object of study. We get that sense, for example, in Joshua chapter 1, when we hear that in verse 8 there, that an angel directs Joshua that the book of Torah, that Moses, this book of Moses' Torah, shouldn't ever leave Joshua's lips. Joshua, in other words, should be sort of murmuring this book, reciting this book in order to memorize it, and in order to have its teachings always in his head. In the ancient world, the way that you would learn something is you would say it over and over again. You would say it out loud. You would sort of meditate on it by reciting it, and by reciting something over and over, it really becomes part of your mind. So here we're learning in Joshua chapter 1 that the book of the Torah is something that you should study, that you should try to memorize, so that it becomes part of it becomes really part of your mind. You see the same exact phrasing, by the way, showing up in Psalm 1, in the first Psalm. It's the exact same phrasing, so I didn't give it to you. You've got it already there from Joshua chapter 1. If we go to page 12, we see something else interesting, which is the teaching that we get from a Torah, from a book of Torah. It also can involve not only law, but narrative. This is another case from the book of Psalms, where we're getting poetic lines that list a number of synonyms for the word Torati, which NJPS translates as teaching, my teaching here. Torati here is parallel to Imre Fi, what I say. So it's a teaching that can be presented orally. It's a mashal, which they translate it as a theme. It's something that one can expound upon. It's something that one thinks about. A mashal can often be translated as an allegory or a proverb. A mashal is an oral saying that you can kind of chew over, to think about what it implies. It's something that you think hard about. You study it, not only in the sense that you murmur it so that you memorize it, you also study it so that you can think about its different meanings, its rich meanings, its various implications. That's the same thing for the next line in Hebrew, chidot mini kedem, which they've translated here in NJPS as lessons from the past, or lessons of the past. Chida is also a word that can be translated as riddle. Again, it's something that you think about, you chew over it, because there might be more to it than initially meets the eye or meets the ear. And so it's worth memorizing so that you can think more about it and appreciate further depths. So the Torah that we're learning about here, it's a Torah that can be presented orally, and you can think about it, you can chew over its meanings. And then in verse 3, we're told that this Torah is also something that avotenu sipru lanu. Our forefathers, our fathers have told us. Lissaper, the verb sipru here, means to tell a story. Lissaper, the verb sipru, is where we get the noun sipur, which means story. So this Torah can be in the form of narrative. In other words, it can be a narrative. It's a story where you can think about the story. You can think about how the plot develops. You can think about the characters and how they relate to each other in the way that we do for serious literature. And by thinking about this narrative, you'll begin to understand something important about our heritage, about our history, or about the world as a whole. So Torah here is guidance that doesn't only come in legal form, it also can come in narrative form. Avotenu sipru lanu, our fathers told us these stories. And it comes in a form that can be studied, murmured, memorized, turned over and over in our head so that we learn something deeper from it. So Torah is guidance that's not only legal guidance, it's also narrative guidance, something that we can study. It's also a learned form of instruction. In fact, in the middle of page 12, we get another text from the book of Isaiah, in which Isaiah talks about his own teaching. which can be written on a scroll that will be rolled up and sealed. It will be covered with twine. That clay or wax will then seal, will close this scroll, and that teaching can be stored for the future among his disciples. Chatom Torah belimudai is the Hebrew there, which JPS translates as seal the instruction among or with my disciples. So Isaiah has his own prophetic disciples. He or they wrote down some of his prophetic statements so that much later on, that scroll can be opened up and it can be studied. So again, here we're getting the idea that Torah is not only law, it's something that can be studied by scholars, by disciples. It's something that can be expounded. Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 5, at the end of page 12, the bottom of page 12, we're told that he expounds or explains this Torah. Torah is something, it's not just totally straightforward. It's something you can read and think about. You can expound it. You can do exegesis. You can do interpretation. You can talk about its implications, aspects of it that aren't immediately evident. This idea that Torah is something that you get from a narrative shows up on page 13, which is from Exodus chapter 13. Towards the end of that passage in verse 9, we're told that you can give yourself reminders of the story of how we came out of Egypt. And if you provide yourself with things that will remind you of the Exodus from Egypt. So for example, earlier in the passage, eating matzah reminds you of the story of the Exodus. That will help Torat Adonai beficha, that will help God's teaching so that it will always be in your mouth. Again, we're getting the idea here that the Torah is something that's presented orally. The Torah is something that can be taught, and it's best taught if it's always there in your mouth and in your mind, if you're able to memorize it so that you can murmur it, you can recite it, and that way you can think more and more about its implications. You can think about its depths. And in this passage, so here in this passage, Torah is associated with learning, with studying, with thinking through things. It's associated with a story. It's associated with a story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. And that story that you study is further associated with ritual actions, specifically in this case, eating matzah and putting certain reminders of the Torah on your body. This is what we interpret in Rabbinic Judaism as being the tefillin that you have on your head and on your arms. So we've got a story here that teaches you something that is closely associated with a ritual law and ritual action. Okay, with all of that, I think we're just about ready to begin to understand why they gave the title Torah to the 5 books of Moses in ancient times, and what we learn about the 5 books of Moses and Jewish culture more generally. Before we go there, though, I think we're about to sort of finish up the dictionary work of this this lecture. Remember, I said that we're really interested in what sort of book is the Torah, but we'd spend most of our time basically writing a dictionary article. We've just come to the end of writing the dictionary article. Before I go back to our main theme, which is what sort of book is the Torah, let me just pause and see if there's some more questions on the dictionary work, the lexicography that I've been covering, and then we'll get back to the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and what sort of book it is in light of the fact that this is the title of it. But Julia, do we have some more questions on just the language stuff that we've been spending so much time on?
I hesitate to break when I feel like you're about to go to the big finish, but I will just, since a few people have asked.
But we got a half hour, so we've got a few minutes, and then I'll get to the big finish.
All right, and there are a lot of wonderful questions that are specific, too specific for us to get to, unfortunately, but wonderful questions nonetheless. But let me ask what a few people have asked. I'm going to read to you 2 different formulations of what I think it's the same topic. So the first person asked, is it an assumption underlying what you're teaching us about all these different meanings that God did not give the Torah through Moses to the Jewish people, but it's just an ancient human authored book? I think the answer to that is no, but that's the way one person put it. And then another person put it this way: if we consider the thesis that there are multiple authors of the Torah, do the different authors have different conceptions of what the Torah is?
Great questions. So regarding question one, as a modern Bible scholar, as a modern biblical critic, like all modern biblical critics, I don't believe that the 5 books of Moses were written by a single author. I think that they were put together with a combination, by combining several different, probably originally independent texts that existed in ancient Israel. So the starting point for all of my analysis, and really for all modern biblical scholarship, is not that Moses wrote down the Torah that God dictated to Moses as one document, but rather that the 5 books of Moses are an anthology that brings together many different post-Moses texts that reflect on and pass on the story of Israelite history and the laws that are associated with that history. I wouldn't say, though, I wouldn't use the phrase that I believe that it is just a human author document. I think that I personally believe in the story of Shavuot. I personally believe that there was a revelation from God to the nation Israel at Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. And I believe that what we're getting in the 5 books of Moses, and really not only in the 5 books of Moses, but in all of the Bible and all of rabbinic literature and all of Jewish thought and creativity, is a human response to an interpretation of that event of revelation at Sinai, an event of revelation that belongs to all of us who are Jewish, not only our ancestors and forebears who were physically there at Sinai, but all of us who the rabbis teach, and really I think already the book of Deuteronomy teaches, all of us in some sense were there for that revelation, and we're all involved in interpreting and reacting to that revelation. So what I think we've got in the 5 books of Moses is we've got an anthology of some of the earliest reactions to and interpretations of that revelatory law-giving event that really formed the Jewish people into what the Jewish people has been for the past, 3,000 or so years.
Can I just ask before you get to the second
Sure.
formulation? So, but I think you understood the question perhaps more deeply than I did. It's also the case that, right, I mean, the idea of multiple translations of a word, that doesn't rely on an assumption of multiple human authors of the Torah or any human authors of the Torah, right? That's a feature of language, that it's used, that words are used differently with different shades of meaning in different contexts.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So the fact that I believe that the 5 books of Moses are an anthology of several different older Israelite texts is not related to the fact that the word Torah has many different meanings. The word Torah is a rich word. All languages have some words that are extraordinarily rich in meaning that a single author or a bunch of authors might use in such a way as to do something with that variety of meanings.
Okay, thanks.
Now, this modern theory about the origin of the 5 books of Moses posits that there are basically 3 or 4 main originally independent documents that existed, I think, before the exile, before the destruction of the first temple, but they were probably edited, woven together to create the 5 books of Moses in the post-exilic period. It's often interesting to see how these different authors, or these different let's say 4 different texts that were edited together, how they use language differently. And that is often the case. I don't think it's so much the case with I don't think it's so much the case with the word Torah. The priestly authors, what we call the priestly authors, they tend to use the word Torah to refer to ritual, but that's not because they thought it was ritual and other authors thought it had a different meaning. It's just that the priests talk more about ritual matters. So there are other cases where there are really interesting differences of vocabulary between the 4 different traditions that were brought together according to modern biblical scholarship to form the Torah. I don't think that that's so much the case with the word Torah. So Julie, do you have maybe one more before I go to the big reveal, or 1 or 2 more? You can decide.
Okay. Well, a lot of people, I was just trying to kind of collate, a lot of people have been asking about later usages of the term in rabbinic literature, in specifically in the prophets, and people use the Torah, the term Torah very generally today to mean kind of like all Jewish teaching, and we all, Yagdil Torah v'yadir, that we all contribute to expanding the Torah. So if you could touch maybe on a kind of later development of the word.
Yeah. So you know what, actually,
You want to hold that?
I want to hold that. So maybe you could kind of remind me because I'm
Sure.
not getting to it.
Okay, I'll try to do that.
But let me get into maybe why I think the word Torah was chosen probably already in the pre-exilic period to refer to the kind of traditions that we're getting in the 5 books of Moses. We saw in what we just did that the Torah can mean instruction generally. It can mean various kinds of legal instruction, ritual law, criminal law, and civil law, as well as just ethical rules and guidance. Furthermore, Torah can refer to a teaching that comes in a narrative form, a teaching that comes in a form that allows you to memorize it and to think it over a good deal so that you can really internalize that teaching and it really becomes part of your mind. That actually fits the wide variety of genres found within the 5 books of Moses that I began today's lecture by mentioning. That is to say, something that's distinctive, a bit unusual, not totally unique, but unusual about the Pentateuch, about the 5 books of Moses, is the way it goes back and forth among different genres. I talked at the beginning about narrative and law, different kinds of narrative, different kinds of law, not to mention maps in prose format and IKEA instruction manuals. The 5 books of Moses bring together a lot of different kinds of genres. They bring together those genres to create a document that provides guidance in more than one sense. And most of the Torah, probably about maybe, I'm guessing here, a good 40% of the Torah is probably, we can classify as legal texts, or to use the Hebrew terminology, halachic texts, and close to 50% of the Torah are narrative texts or agadic texts, to use the Hebrew term agadic texts, narrative texts that allow us to think through some issues, that allow us to achieve some sort of conclusion, that allow us to get some sort of teaching. So the Torah is teaching, I think, in primarily 2 related ways. The Torah is legal teaching, and the Torah is also narrative teaching. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, combine Torah in both of those senses, combine texts that provide both types of Torah, guidance that comes from law and guidance that comes from literature, you might say, guidance that comes from, to use a famous Greek term, nomos, as well as guidance that comes from narrative. The Torah, in other words, is, I think, the Pentateuch, the Chumash, gets the title Torah because the noun Torah can refer to different kinds of guidance, guidance that comes from law, as well as guidance that comes from literature or storytelling, guidance that comes from something that you think through and interpret. And in that respect, I think that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is a very significant Jewish book because we're learning something about Judaism when we realize that for us, guidance has to take both forms. That true Torah is guidance that is sort of cut and dried, clear legal guidance, but also the more flexible and contextual guidance that we find in a narrative that teaches us something. In other words, Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are a combination of narrative and law, in which I think that the narrative comes to justify the law, comes to contextualize the law, and the law depends upon the narrative. that idea of combining law and narrative in such a way that the narrative justifies and contextualizes the law, that becomes a really central idea to all later Judaism. So to give one example of this, let's go to the page 14 in the handout, where I give you the very first comment of the most important and most famous commentary in all of Jewish literature, Rashi's commentary on the Torah, on the 5 books of Moses. Rashi asks here, he quotes a question actually of Rabbi Yitzchak, in which he asked the following question at the very beginning of his Torah commentary. The text says, the question says, the Torah should have started with the verse, "This month shall be the first of your months." This month shall be the first of your months. That's Exodus chapter 12. That is the first legal text in the Torah, the first halachic text in the Torah that goes on to give us the laws of Passover. So the Torah should have started. You might have thought that the Torah should have started at Exodus chapter 12. So why does it start steps? Why instead does it begin with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1? In the beginning of God's creation, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and so forth. Now, what's interesting here, and the answer is, well, the book of Genesis explains that God created the world. God then went on to form the Jewish people by choosing Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants that they would inherit the land of Canaan. And God had the right to do that because God created the world. The entire world belongs to God. And so if anybody wants to say the Israelites have no right to the land of Canaan, they can point out that, well, they've got the right to the land of Canaan because the creator of the world gave them this land. Now, what I'm most interested, there's a lot we could talk about here, but what I'm most interested in this initial comment of Rashi's commentary on the Torah is you might say the hava amina, to use the Aramaic translation terminology. I'm interested in sort of the initial assumption that this question starts from and then goes beyond. The initial assumption of this question at the very beginning, you would have thought that the Torah should start at Exodus 12, and why doesn't it? That initial assumption assumes the Torah is a book of law. Therefore, the question we need to ask about it is, well, why does it start with so much narrative? You get 50 chapters of the book of Genesis, about 49 of which are narrative material, one of which is poetic material. Then you get 11 chapters in the book of Exodus, most of which is narrative material, some of which is genealogical. And only then in Exodus chapter 12, in the 64th chapter of the Torah, do we get law. So you might think, why do we have to wait 63 chapters before we get some law in what is supposed to be a law book? And the answer is, well, it isn't just a law book. It's a book that justifies the laws that are going to follow. We find out that God has the right to give Israel law and to give Israel a land, A, because God created the world, and B, in the book of Exodus, we go on to find out because God rescued the Israelites from slavery. So the narrative is there to motivate and justify the law. This idea of a book that combines law and narrative in such a way that the law gives a context for the narrative gives a context for the law. We can't really understand what the law really is without that narrative. And also the narrative justifies the law. We don't understand why the law is authoritative without the narrative. That kind of book is the sort of book we're getting in the 5 books of Moses. And we get that kind of book later on in Jewish culture as well. In fact, that becomes a very typical genre in Jewish culture. If you think about it, the Talmud is also that kind of a book. In the Talmud, we're constantly going back and forth between halacha and agadah, where we quote legal passages from the Mishnah. Those passages are then explained and justified, and the explanations often go into narrative material. The justifications often go into interpretive and explanatory material. The Talmud, like the 5 books of Moses, and this is true of both Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, is an interesting combination of law and narrative. That genre doesn't disappear. We get that again later on in Jewish literature. If you think about what in some senses was the most influential and significant logical restatement of the law in Jewish history, that book is Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, which we think of as a law code, but it's not only a law code. The Mishneh Torah begins with a narrative and philosophical section called Sefer Hamadah that explains the philosophical and historical background to the law. Then the rest of the Mishneh Torah, the rest of the volumes, they're all legal in nature. But before going into law, Maimonides provides us with an ideological, idea-oriented background for the law. And he literally begins just by telling the story of how the law made it from heaven to Mount Sinai to the Middle Ages. So Maimonides literally begins his law book with narrative. Beginning a law book with a long narrative philosophical discussion might seem like an odd thing to do, but it isn't so odd from the point of view of Jewish culture, because that's what the Pentateuch does. The Pentateuch begins with a lot of narrative that justifies the law, and only then begins to go into law in Exodus chapter 12. That's what the Talmud does, as it jumps back and forth constantly between law and narrative. There's one other form of literature where we get this combination of law and narrative, and it's an extremely important genre for anyone who's trying to learn Jewish law, and that is the literature of shutim, she'elot u'tshuvot, in other words, the responsa literature. There are a lot of people think that if you really want to become a competent decisor of Jewish law, really want to become competent in making judgments in Jewish law, you shouldn't just memorize stuff from law codes like the Shulchan Aruch. What you've got to do is you've got to read the shut literature, the literature in which people would ask questions of a rabbi, and the rabbi then responds. I mean, this is a literature that exists from the early Middle Ages. It continues to exist today. In the conservative movement, we have a committee officially that gets questions and responds to questions and often publishes its response to questions. To really understand Jewish law, you've got to read it from the question, but you've got to come to know it by reading the questions that prompt the answers that decisors or rabbis or poskim provide. And if you think about it, any shut, any responsum, is actually an example of Torah in the sense of a combination of narrative and law. A responsum always begins with a question, and the question always involves a little short story. If I'm calling, to go back to my example from earlier, if I'm calling the rabbi of my shul and I'm saying to him, and I'm asking him a question, that question begins with a story. I opened up the meat drawer in my kitchen, and I saw a milk knife in the meat drawer. Now, as stories goes, it's probably not going to win the Pulitzer. It's probably not going to get accepted by the Atlantic or the New Yorker. That wasn't like the most interesting story, but that is a short narrative. All shutim, all rabbinic responsa begin with a narrative in which a person explains, here's what happens, here's what happened, here's the situation that I'm in. And the response is always a response to that situation. Properly understood, Jewish law, halacha, it isn't simply a whole list of things you've got to memorize to do. Rather, it's always contextual. It's always related to a particular situation. If one's Judaism is a purely halachic Judaism, and one's Judaism doesn't include questions of motivation and context that come from understanding a person's story, or a community's story, or our people's story, then that Judaism is defective and dangerous. I think that such kinds of Judaism historically have existed and do exist. Purely halachic Judaism is a defective form of Judaism. our law is certainly central to Judaism and it's obligatory, but to understand how and why the law obligates us, and therefore how we're supposed to observe the law, we need to know about our own context as communities, as members of communities, as individuals, as part of the Jewish people. Only then do we know how to observe this law as well as why to observe this law. And so I think that the decision of some ancient scribes to create a Torah that combines law and narrative, and the decision of Jewish culture to make this book, the Chumash, the central work of Jewish culture, and then the subsequent decisions of the rabbis to create the Talmuds, of Maimonides to create the Mishnah Torah, of rabbis up until literally the present day to write responsa literature, all those decisions are decisions that put a combination of law and narrative at the center of Judaism. And so pausing to think about, well, what kind of book is the Torah? That's actually a very, very revealing in terms of what it tells us about a healthy, authentic Judaism. A Judaism that is purely halachic is not a healthy Judaism. A Judaism that is purely agadic, that only is interested in ideas and stories and doesn't involve an idea of obligation that we are living out every single day of our life, that is not a healthy Judaism. That's not an authentic Judaism. An authentic and healthy Judaism is one that combines law and narrative, which is what we Jews have been doing since the pre-exilic period, since what I would call the literary genre of Torah was created. So I guess I would want to say that in Judaism, there is a genre, there's a literary form that I would call Torah that combines law and narrative. And a healthy Judaism is a Judaism that is always coming back to texts that include law and narrative and that study law and narrative with each other. I'll go as far as that. We've got some time left for some questions. So Julia, maybe you can curate a little bit and we'll see where we go.
Okay, well, first, thank you so much. I mean, lots of comments in the chat, with which I wholeheartedly agree about the brilliance of what you just shared, and we all are mind blown, as the young people would say. And I love the way I love your reading of that Rashi, which I've studied so many times, but you know, it's such a deeper reading that the Torah doesn't start with the law, not just to say something about humanity, but to say something about the nature of the Torah.
Nature of the Torah, and
yeah.
therefore the nature of Judaism.
Yeah.
The nature of Judaism.
Well, okay, so you addressed several of the questions. There was a question about Torah Shebaal Peh, but you explained beautifully how it translates so well into that context, the oral Torah. Well,
Actually, that, if I could just interject there, right, coming back to that last question, the one that I punted. So the word Torah in later Jewish culture comes to mean all Jewish learning, all Jewish learning. So, the Mishnah Torah by Maimonides is a work of Torah. Heschel's book, God in Search of Man, that's a work of Torah. It's very clear from the way the rabbis in the Talmud talk about the term Torah that this lecture that I'm giving today is a work of Torah, and also that the questions that you're sending to the chat to Julia, those are works of Torah too. The rabbis are very, very clear about that, that what a student asks the master, asks the teacher, those questions are part of Torah. So Torah means all of Jewish learning, not only the 5 books of Moses. And I think it's really important for us to always remember, therefore, as we produce new Torah, that our Torah should include both law and narrative. As I'm teaching, as you're asking questions, as you're teaching people, your kids, your grandkids, your own students, for those of you who are teachers out there, as you're producing new Torah, if it's going to be an authentic and healthy Torah, then the new Torah that we produce should be part of this genre of Torah that combines law and narrative, and that's why I think it's really important to realize that Judaism is the religion of Torah, not just in the sense of the 5 books of Moses, but in the sense that Torah includes all of Jewish teaching, including teachings that don't get written down. And to the extent that that's the case, a healthy, authentic Judaism has to have both these parts.
I mean, it's also, you brought this in when you talked about responsa literature, but it's really an argument for the idea that law has to evolve over time.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the narrative by inherently, evolves over time as people continue to live on.
It's a narrative law. Narrative has a plot. Narrative goes in new directions over time. And that, yeah, an authentic Jewish law has to do that. Certainly. Yeah.
So maybe taking it to a new place, one person asked, is it possible that the Torah combines different literary genres because different people understand things presented in different formats?
I think certainly that's part of it. Yeah, that's a great question. It's a question that reminds me of a famous midrash on Psalm 29 that talks, Kol Adonai Bakoach, when Psalm 29 says that God's voice, which the rabbis read Psalm 29 as a description of revelation at Sinai, of law giving at Sinai, when Psalm 29 says God's voice had power or was within power, in Midrash, in Shmot Rabbah and a few other places, the rabbis interpret this to what was that special power of the law giving at Sinai? God spoke to each individual who was there in that individual's own language. I mean, they all spoke Hebrew, presumably, but by their own language. I mean, we all have different learning style. We all have different abilities to understand. We all have different interests. The rabbis are saying that God spoke to all the individuals there as individuals. God said, if there were 600,000 Jews there, God said 600,000 different things. It's not just Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. It's not just that God used two different verbs when giving the commandment for Shabbos. God spoke the Torah, the same Torah, in different ways to everyone who was there. And everyone who was there included not only the people who were alive, according to the rabbis, but all Jews. We were all standing at Sinai. Anyone who was ever going to be born Jewish, according to the rabbis, anyone who was ever going to convert to Judaism, according to the rabbis, their souls were already there at Sinai, even though their bodies didn't exist yet. And God spoke to all of them individually. And so I think that's part of it. Different genres speak to people in different ways. But I wouldn't want to put too much emphasis on that. That's a really important idea. I think if we put too much emphasis on that, we could end up saying, well, I'll be a halachic Jew, or I'll be an agadic Jew. And a Jew who's only a halachic Jew is a Jew whose Judaism is defective and dangerous. A Jew whose Judaism is only a narrative kind of Judaism, an agadic Judaism, is a Jew whose Judaism, I think, is defective. I don't know if it's dangerous, but I think it's not going to last very long. And that's something that we have a lot of in modern Judaism. There are forms of Judaism that are purely halachic, and that's really a tragedy and dangerous if it's just a legalistic Judaism. And there are forms of Judaism that don't have much in the way of law. And those forms of Judaism are defective. They may not be dangerous, but I don't think they're going to last more. That person's grandchildren won't have any form of Judaism. So I think it's really important to see, we might gravitate towards this or that type, but a healthy, authentic, lasting Judaism has to have both parts of the Torah genre.
And also, I think the fact that any given law, one person might learn through a code, one person might learn through a Socratic interchange, one person might learn through a narrative. I think it. Sorry, someone said preach it. I think it's all encompassed in what you're saying.
Yeah, but
right.
I would add that, like, there are people who feel that learning law, especially for a rabbi, learning law only from Shulchan Aruch, only from a code, as opposed to from responsum literature, that there is something dangerous there.
Yeah.
And the great poskim are great because of their command of shut literature, of responsa literature, not because they've memorized the Shulchan Aruch. I mean, Ovadia Yosef, supposedly, to take one of the great poskim of the 20th century, what made him such an extraordinary posek wasn't that he had memorized lots and lots of laws. It's that before there were CD-ROMs, he had a totally encyclopedic memory for shut literature, and he could remember, what she's asking me, there was a kind of similar, very difficult case in the 12th century in Italy. And like without a CD, now like people can find this using keywords with a CD-ROM, but he would remember there was a case like this in the 12th century that can provide a precedent. If you're just applying things from a law code, it can become mechanical, and that's what I mean when I say dangerous, and sometimes even perhaps cruel. Whereas a law that is based more in narrative, it will take the person's context into account to a greater extent, I think, and that's important for poskim. And that's a big part, I think, of the training that we do at JTS. I mean, you could talk more about that, Julia, having taken those courses.
Yeah, there were so many directions that we could go in, how we think about constitutional law, how we train rabbis, which, in the old days, we didn't train them with practical rabbinics, i.e. the narrative, and now we do, but we're out of time. But you have given us so much to think about, and such an amazing frame with which to go into Shavuot and receiving the Torah, which now we can really understand what that means in an incredibly full way. So thank you so much for this wonderful teaching, this wonderful Torah. I'm putting, thanks to everyone for joining, and I'm putting into the chat a link again for signing up for our next series. And finally, I want to once again thank our sponsors for today, Yale Asphalt and the talkback group of Temple Israel Scranton and beyond. We're so grateful to both parties for your sponsorship. And thanks everyone for learning with us this semester. We're very excited to learn with you again, starting in just a couple of weeks, right after Shavuot, just a 1-week break. And then we will, after the wonderful exploration of learning with our amazing alumni, we will come back to learning with our amazing faculty in the fall. So thanks so much to everyone for joining us and for expanding Torah with us.
Toda rabah. Thank you all, and a Chag Matan Torah Sameach, Chag Shavuot Sameach. Litrot. Bye-bye.
Chag Sameach.